Greetings, welcome everybody. I am Susie Clark, the director of the Mahindra Humanities Center and the Morton B. Knoefel Professor of Music. It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to the 2025 Tanner Lectures on Human Values, featuring our distinguished guest, Ruha Benjamin, whose lecture series is on Imagining Beyond the Artificial Intelligentsia. The Tanner Lectures were established in 1978 and are an annual celebration of academic excellence and intellectual vigor, enlivening campus communities at 9 universities in the United States and abroad. Harvard is, as always, proud to be among them, and prouder still to host outstanding scholars whose work enriches all of our lives. Obert Clark Tanner, who founded these lectures, studied philosophy at Stanford and Harvard, and he taught philosophy and was the scholar of the New Testament at Stanford and Utah for over 30 years. At the same time, he ran a business, and it started humbly. He started by making class rings in his mother's basement, and later founded the O.C. Tanner Company, which became a leading manufacturer of employee recognition awards for exceptional talent. The benefaction of Obert and Grace Tanner and the O.C. Tanner Company support these lectures on human values, which are dedicated to, and I quote, enriching the intellectual and moral life of humankind and to the search for a better understanding of human behavior and human values. I can think of no person who meets that requirement than Ruha Benjamin. Much like the idea of the Tanner Lectures, bringing community together to think about human values, the Harvard Tanner Appointment Committee comprised faculty from across Harvard, including the Law School, the Divinity School, and the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. The committee was Gina Kim, Hisa Kuriyama, Kenneth Mack, Martha Minow, Charlie Stang, and Bruno Carvalho, who was the interim director of the Mahindra Center last year and chair of the Tanner Committee. Thank you all very much. My thanks also go to the team at the Mahindra Humanities Center for planning today's event. I'm grateful to Steve Beal, the executive director of the Mahindra Humanities Center, and to Mary McKinnon, the events coordinator, and to the rest of the outstanding staff of the Mahindra Center. I'm also grateful to Beth Mullins and Nancy Schaffman in the music department for allowing us to use this space. And now to our guest of honor. We are joined today by Ruha Benjamin, who is the Alexander Stewart 1886 Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University and founding director of the Ida B. Wells Just Data Lab. Professor Benjamin's research is at the intersection of science, medicine, and technology, focusing on the relationship between innovation and social inequity. Her prize-winning scholarship and teaching has been recognized through numerous accolades. Most recently, she was awarded a MacArthur Foundation Genius Fellowship in 2024. Her books include Race After Technology, Abolitionist Tools for the New Jim Code from 2019, Viral Justice, How We Grow the World We Want from 2022, and most recently, Imagination, a Manifesto, 2024. In these and her other writings, Ruha Benjamin explores various societal systems, including policing and incarceration systems, medical practices, education systems, and everything down to municipal budgets and decisions. She scrutinizes their attendant technologies in our contemporary digital life for how they reflect, amplify, and perpetuate existing inequities and systemic injustices of the world, particularly as they relate to race. She illustrates how such disparities that are created are preventable if only we embraced a different imagination for a world we could be living in. Her critiques are often searing, but they are foundational to her quest for more just and humane outcomes. Our respondent today is Evelyn Hammonds, who is the Barbara Gutman-Rosenkreutz Professor of the History of Science and Professor of African and African American Studies in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. And she is also Professor of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the Chan School of Public Health here at Harvard. Her research focuses on the history of scientific, medical, and socio-political concepts of race, gender, and sexuality in the histories of medicine, science, and public health in the United States, as well as Black feminist and queer theory and the history of disease and race. Amongst her numerous roles at Harvard, she's the director of the Project on Race and Gender in Science and Medicine at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research. She is the recipient of numerous awards, but I highlight only two. She is an elected member of the American Academy of the Arts and Sciences and the National Academy of Medicine. So the format for today is that we will first hear the lecture by Ruha Benjamin, and the topic for lecture 1 is Who Owns the Future? The Artificial Intelligentsia and the New Eugenics. And then we will hear a response by Evelyn Hammonds, which will then be followed by a conversation between Professors Benjamin and Hammonds. Please join us tomorrow in the same room at the same time for the second lecture. And on Friday, there will be a lunchtime seminar, which will be an opportunity for further conversation and questions. So please join me in bringing to the stage Ruha Benjamin.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay? Wonderful. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Professor Clark. My gratitude to the Tanner Committee for inviting me and the program organizers, especially Mary McKinnon, for coordinating my visit. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces. My overflowing thanks also to Professors Hammond, Tracy K. Smith, Kahiba Badaroun, all friends of my mind, as Morrison would say. And it's really lovely to be in conversation as they've structured. I appreciate all of you taking time amidst so many stressors and oppressors weighing heavy, including the fact that there are members of the Harvard and surrounding communities for whom simply walking across campus to attend a lecture has become a treacherous ordeal, with the threat of revoked student visas and ICE abductions looming large. A heightened level of threat and unease that is part of a much longer legacy of repression in which our institutions have not simply been the target, but often our antagonist. The fact is, the vast majority of us hail from people who would never have been allowed to step foot in this space, except as ghosts laboring in the shadows. So perhaps we can invite them in, too, to take up space, to stir or haunt us, if they will, and to remind ourselves, as Du Bois did when he was lauded as the first African American to earn a PhD at this institution, that the honor, I assure you, is Harvard's. After all, the question of deservedness continues to be weaponized by the pitiful proponents of segregation and supremacy today. So to those who question our presence, the honor, I assure you, is Harvard's, and Princeton's, and Yale's, and definitely Columbia's, and every other symbol of excellence built on the fragile qualifications of a very narrow slice of humanity who even now would rather keep us out of these halls than face their own lack of exception. So in calling upon our intellectual kindred, past, present, and emerging, let us also acknowledge that we are gathering at a time when emerging technologies necessarily evoke visions of settling the future, a future too often cast as white and post-human, with Indigenous, Black, and other racialized people locked into a dystopian present. Which is why Anishinaabe Professor Grace Dillon encourages Native, First Nations, and Indigenous authors and artists to speak back to the colonial tropes of science fiction, and I would add science. Dillon explains that Indigenous futurism advocates for the sovereign. It dares to let Indigenous creators define themselves and their world, not just as speaking back to colonialism, but as existing in their own right. That is not to say that the past is ignored, but rather that it is folded into the present, which is folded into the future, a philosophical wormhole that renders the very definitions of time and space fluid in the imagination. Alas, a fluid imagination is exactly what's needed in the face of fixed tropes of progress and innovation that seek to colonize our very conception of a world in which we can all thrive. So what might an analysis of our current historical moment through the lens of Indigenous futurism entail? For starters, I think it would entail a deep disgust with military technologies, euphemistically called lavender, who's your daddy, and the gospel, automating warfare and raining hell on our Palestinian kin, ripping into the flesh of children and erasing entire families from the face of the earth with our tax dollars in our name. We have guided missiles and misguided men, King lamented over 60 years ago to an audience at Stanford University, of all places, the belly of the Silicon Beast, though I think he was being very generous, saying misguided. Indigenous futurism, like Afrofuturism, also takes aim at subtler forms of tech-mediated cruelty and injustice, those that escape scrutiny precisely because they come wrapped in the guise of efficiency and progress. But efficient at what? Progress for whom? Is what we must continuously ask. And here I want to offer a deep bow of respect to the students, including many Jewish students, who refuse to allow their identity to be used as justification for the suffering and silencing of others, pushing our institutions to reckon seriously with academic complicity in weapons manufacturing, warmongering, and AI-powered atrocities. The fact that the powers that be are spending so much time and energy villainizing those seeking an end to the Palestinian genocide and criminalizing any criticism of genocide enablers tells us something about the power of students when organized and about the hypocrisy of our institutions when it comes to academic freedom. Toni Morrison said it best in an essay published in 1995, in which she traces the connection between the creep of fascism and the censorship of dissent. Let us be reminded that before there is a final solution, there must be a first, a second one, even a third. Step one, start with constructing an internal enemy as both focus and diversion. Step two, Isolate and demonize that enemy by unleashing and protecting the utterance of overt and coded name-calling and verbal abuse. Step 3, enlist and create sources and distributors of information who are willing to reinforce the demonizing process because it is profitable, because it grants power, and because it works. Step 4, palisade all art forms, monitor, discredit, or expel those that challenge or destabilize processes of demonization and deification. Step 5, subvert and malign all representatives of and sympathizers with this constructed enemy. Step 6, solicit from among the enemy collaborators who agree with and can sanitize the dispossession process. Step 7, pathologize the enemy in scholarly and popular mediums. Recycle, for example, scientific racism and the myths of racial superiority in order to naturalize the pathology. Step 8, criminalize the enemy. Then prepare, budget for, and rationalize the building of and holding arenas for the enemy, especially its males and absolutely its children. Step 9, reward mindlessness and apathy with monumentalized entertainments and with little pleasures, tiny seductions, a few minutes on television, a few lines in the press, a little pseudo-success, the illusion of power and influence, a little fun, a little style, a little consequence. Step 10, maintain at all costs silence. And so it goes without saying that a crucial part of combating fascism is refusing to be silent. Which for me raises the question, for those of us who claim to oppose a bloody final solution, how are we nonetheless complicit in enabling and looking away from the first, the second, the third steps on the march towards authoritarianism? Few brief examples come to mind to ground Morrison's formulation. First is to consider the rate of mass deportations under different administrations. In his first term, Trump deported approximately 1.5 million people, or about half as many as Obama deported in his first term. So no surprise that many immigrant justice groups call the first Black president the deporter-in-chief. Likewise, when it comes to the ICE raids that have long terrorized immigrant communities, the Department of Homeland Security reported that in the first weeks of Trump's second term, he deported approximately 5,700 undocumented residents. And that if his administration continues at the current clip, it would be on track to deport half the number of migrants deported during Biden's last full fiscal year in 2024. As history PhD student Jana Hayter tweeted late last month in response to liberal outrage over the current round of ICE abductions, deportation and denaturalization have always been civil and not criminal procedures. That means that the Bill of Rights has never applied. This includes the rights to an attorney, a fair, speedy public trial. I'm not saying this to be like, calm down, this is how it's always been. Quite the opposite, Hayter says. I'm saying this because it has always been this bad. To those finally waking up to the reality that if they can do this to undocumented people and legal permanent residents, they can do it to anyone, she says, that's what we've been trying to tell you. Kidnapping someone and ripping them away from their family has always been evil, regardless of immigration status. Again, a final solution rests on a first solution, which brings me to another example of this slippery slope towards fascism. This one in our own backyards, linking what happens out there in the political sphere to what happens in here, the academic sphere. Consider the Harvard dissertation authored by Jason Richwine in 2013 entitled IQ and Immigration, which argued that recent Hispanic immigrants have lower IQs than so-called
native whites, which of course assumes that these are genetically distinct groups and that IQ race theory is scientifically credible. As one anthropologist commenting on the dissertation put it, that's a bit like saying those who attend Harvard are genetically distinct and naturally superior. And lest I mischaracterize Richwine's work, in his own words, the dissertation shows that recent immigrants' scores lower than US-born whites on many different types of IQ tests. Using statistical analysis, it suggests that the test score differential is due primarily to a real cognitive gap rather than to culture or language bias. The dissertation analyzes how this cognitive gap could affect socioeconomic assimilation, and it concludes by exploring how IQ selection might be incorporated as one factor among many into immigration policy. It's that last part I'm most interested in. How the ideas we research and write about are used to shape people's life chances. Another way to put it again is that the final solutions out there can often be traced to the first solutions theorized in here. One last example of this relationship between first and final that brings artificial intelligence into the mix. Yes, the Trump administration's current use of AI to identify and deport pro-Palestinian students is an extension of the Biden administration's unabashed criminalization of activists, and an extension of university administrators' repression of their own students and faculty, academic freedom, except for Palestine. My point is that if we are scandalized by what Trump is doing, we should also be outraged about what Democrats and university officials have been doing. As Morrison writes, the move towards a final solution is not a jump. It takes one step, then another, then another. The take home for me is that seemingly small actions, whether in the direction of fascism or freedom, matter. And that we should be moved to act, not when the smell of burning flesh reaches our doorstep, but when the first match is struck, whether it's struck in law, in media, in academic publications. So that one way to understand the polycrises we face as a people and a planet, including the current administration's dismantling of an already rigged democracy by an unhinged broligarchy, is that those cushioned by wealth and status looked away again and again. When poor people and indigenous people and immigrants and incarcerated and queer, trans, disabled people and students and all those who smelled the smoke were ringing the alarm. So when it comes to the long list of AI-mediated first, second, and third solutions that are sold to us as efficiency and neutrality, we would do well to understand them as forms of automated austerity, a la Virginia Eubanks, and algorithmic oppression, a la Sophia Noble. And unfortunately, the end game is not simply an AI-powered coup, but an even more ambitious project to colonize the future by, first of all, hijacking and hollowing out the state so that it can't stand in the way, that is, regulate the eugenic schemes of the artificial intelligentsia. So in this first lecture, my aim is to sketch some of the ideological dimensions of this longer term project. Then tomorrow, I want to move beyond these archaic visions of superiority and domination and invite us into an alternative imagination founded on our fundamental interdependence as people and planet. To that end, I'm grounding the lectures with the brilliance of James Baldwin. There is a reason, after all, that some people wish to colonize the moon and others dance before it as an ancient friend. Today, we focus on those would-be colonizers, but tomorrow, we dance among friends, including many thinkers, artists, organizers, whose planetary visions give us the tools to resist and reimagine the techno-status quo. And I admit to you, I found myself resenting the process of writing part one of this lecture, however necessary it is to set the stage, because I'm fed up with centering those self-styled guardians of the galaxy, those who have created the problems against which we must guard. Just last month, J.D. Vance spoke at the Paris AI Summit, pronouncing that, quote, "Our schools will teach students how to manage, how to supervise, how to interact with AI-enabled tools as they become more and more a part of our everyday lives." The same J.D. Vance, who gave a speech in 2021 titled, "The Universities Are the Enemy." In his words, if any of us want to do things we want to do for this country and for the people who live in it, we have to honestly and aggressively attack the universities in this country, he said. More recently, anti-DEI crusader Christopher Rufo, in describing his self-proclaimed counter-revolution blueprint, says that in attacking the Department of Education, the Trump administration must go after the ideological programs, the grants for critical race theory and gender ideology and liberatory pedagogy, whatever you may have. All of that just needs to be burned to the ground. I mean, really, truly, it needs to be gutted and dismantled. Then there's the founder of the anti-egalitarian, anti-democratic philosophical movement known as the Dark Enlightenment, a character named Curtis Yarvin, who has the ear of many Silicon Valley elites. Yarvin argues that the most powerful people in the West today, measured strictly by their ability to influence the real world, are journalists and professors. I know y'all don't feel that powerful. And finally, in describing students, who we can see as putting that liberatory pedagogy into practice by opposing a US-sponsored genocide, surveillance czar and Palantir CEO Alex Karp said, "We kind of think these things that are happening on college campuses are a sideshow." No, they are the show. Because if we lose the intellectual debate, he said, you will not be able to deploy an army in the West ever. At least he understands that intellectual debate can have real life and death consequences. The question is, do we? My point in highlighting these statements is twofold. One, we should think carefully about the fact that the most influential AI boosters a la Vance and the PayPal mafia are also the most ruthless higher ed attackers. And two, if those attacking the educational enterprise understand the dangers of liberatory pedagogy, then we sure as hell need to channel it for social transformation. And so even though I would prefer that the artificial intelligentsia take up as little real estate in my mind as possible, space that I would rather fill with the brilliance of Morrison and Baldwin and so many other thinkers and visionaries, I also accept the fact that weeding is a necessary part of sowing the world we want. So let's do just that. Rewinding now to 2019, there's a documentary called The Great Hack, which I encourage everyone to watch if you haven't already. There's this powerful moment when the narrator is explaining the goals of those weaponizing digital tools to manipulate the electorate during the 2016 US election and Brexit referendum in the UK. The aim of disinformation dictators like Steve Bannon, we're told, is to break society. If you want to fundamentally change society, you first have to break it. It's only when you break it that you can remodel the pieces into your vision of a new society. Of course, their vision is nothing new. More white supremacy, more class oppression, more patriarchy, more ableism, more reproductive injustice, more imperialism. But to get more, they need to break or continue breaking the social contract by deepening divisions and amplifying hierarchies, deploying what is better termed anti-social media, working overtime to erode the very notion of society and the obligations that flow from it in order to privatize and profit from selling us goods and services in place of the social safety net. In recent months, more people have felt this breaking and its eugenic dimensions firsthand as the cuts to education, employment, healthcare are hitting those most vulnerable, the hardest, but which are coming for all of us. The upside is that more people are finally coming to understand how AI evangelists have been working to break society in very tangible ways. Facial recognition software leading to false arrests, digital triage systems rationing healthcare, smart weapons ripping through the flesh with a click, hiring and firing algorithms automating discrimination. But rather than focus only on the harms, I also think it's important to shine a light on those who seek to profit from a broken society. As billionaire Mark Andreessen recently tweeted, a world in which human wages crash from AI logically necessarily is a world in which productivity growth goes through the roof. A consumer cornucopia, he celebrates. Move fast and break things, never mind the people, places broken in the process. But if the point is to ultimately remodel the pieces, what exactly is this noble vision? Enter startup nations, and as Trump's 2024 campaign put it, freedom cities. The network state ruled by tech corporations is not exactly a new vision, but is tied to a much older desire to replace democracies with technocracies. As San Francisco-based journalist Gil Duran writes, these cities will be controlled entirely by tech billionaires and corporations operating outside of US laws. These so-called freedom cities are better understood as fascist cities because, as Duran explains, the broligarchy believes that democracy is an outmoded software. So these are going to be cities without workers' rights. These are going to be cities where the owners of the city, the corporations, the billionaires have all the power. Sounds like a Black Mirror episode. But as journalists Carolyn Haskins and Victoria Elliott explained, several groups representing startup nations are busy drafting congressional legislation to create freedom cities in the US. According to interviews and presentations viewed by the Wired, the goal of these cities would be to have places where anti-aging clinical trials, nuclear reactor startups, building construction can proceed without having to get prior approval from the FDA, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, EPA, et cetera. In a 2012 talk to a crowd of California techies, Curtis Yarvin encouraged the need for what he calls rage, retire all government employees, calling for a national CEO of what's called a dictator. He says, this is 2012. In Yarvin's words, if Americans want to change their government, they're going to have to get over their dictator phobia. He conceded that given the current political divisions, it might be better to have two dictators, one for red staters, one for blue staters. The trick would be to make them work together. There's really no other solution, Yarvin concluded to warm applause. This plea for autocracy is the essence of Yarvin's work. He has concluded that America's problems come not from a deficit of democracy, but from an excess of it. Or, as he puts it, chronic kinglessness. Like Balaji Srinivasan, who wrote a book called The Network State, describing Bitcoin as the future of finance and corporate city-states as the future of government, Peter Thiel sees corporations as the governments of the future and capitalists such as himself as the kings. So what stands in the way of the artificial intelligentsia materializing their vision? Well, as I said earlier, many of these guys think we do. Professors, students, journalists, anyone who refuses to bow to the broligarchy and their archaic visions of the future. Computer scientist Timnit Gebru and philosopher Emil Torres have worked to further trace the ideological underpinnings of this warped vision, coining the acronym TESCREAL to describe a bundle of ideologies that animate the faux futurism of the artificial intelligentsia. TESCREAL adherents are, according to Gebru and Torres, inspired by utopian ideals similar to the visions of first-wave eugenicists, and see artificial general intelligence as integral to the realization of these visions. They point out that the race to build AGI is proliferating products that harm the very same groups that were harmed by first-wave eugenicists. And the discriminatory attitudes of past eugenicists remain widespread within the AGI movement, resulting in systems that harm marginalized groups and centralize power under the guise of safety and benefiting humanity. So I'd encourage anyone who wants to dig deep into this, definitely check out this article on the TESCREAL bundle. For our purposes today, though, I'm gonna just linger on two pillars, long-termism and effective altruism, in part because I think they can be the most alluring to young people and anyone who earnestly wants to do good in the world. To that point, it's worth remembering that old school eugenics was historically a philosophy and a movement popularized by social progressives. And many prominent eugenicists saw themselves as the good guys, from scientists to doctors, professors to university presidents. If eugenicists of the past understood themselves as caretakers of humanity, then today's futurists selling us fantasies of superintelligence are the harbingers of a new eugenics. Their goal is to use advanced technologies to radically enhance themselves, thus creating a superior race of post-humans. According to the founder of the now shuttered Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford, Nick Bostrom, humanity as we know it, flesh and blood Homo sapiens, old school. In superintelligence, he envisions genetic selection for traits like intelligence, health, hardiness, and appearance becoming normalized, such that nations would face the prospect of becoming cognitive backwaters and losing out in economic, scientific, military, and prestige contests with competitors that embrace the new human enhancement technologies. These AI evangelists also envision digital descendants in the deep future who will or should be granted the same moral standing as legacy humans. That's you and me. If the machines have conscious minds, Bostrom suggests, then the welfare of the working machine minds could even appear to be the most important aspect of the outcome, since they may dominate numerically. For context, in 2023, Bostrom issued an apology for comments he made in a group email when he was a 23-year-old postgrad at London School of Economics, in which he used the N-word and argued that, quote, blacks are more stupid than whites. I like that sentence, and I think it is true. But recently, I've begun to believe that I won't have much success with most people if I speak like that. An invitation of sorts for us to read between the lines and beyond the euphemisms and altruistic platitudes, listening for the often racist and colonialist logics that animate the artificial intelligentsia, including those who fancy themselves our colleagues. Because even in his apology, Bostrom never withdrew his central contention regarding race and intelligence. Bostrom's collaborator, Australian philosopher Toby Ord, argues that since almost all of humanity's life lies in the future, almost everything of value lies in the future as well. To risk destroying this future for the sake of some advantage limited only to the present seems to me profoundly parochial and dangerously short-sighted. It privileges a tiny minority of humans over the overwhelming majority yet to be born. It privileges this particular century over millions or maybe billions yet to come. But speaking of tiny minorities, the we in these futurist visions are building a movement defined by a familiar mix of elitism and saviorism. And here I want to emphasize that long-termism, as they envision it, is not the same as long-term thinking, where we reckon seriously with how our present-day actions impact the future. Instead, AI evangelists are warping the idea of altruism to wrap their self-interest in the cloak of humanistic concern. When it comes to worrying about existential risks, for example, they say we need not be too concerned with feel-good projects like eliminating poverty, addressing climate change, preventing wars. Instead, we need to ensure, above all else, that our digital descendants prosper. As Torres explains, it makes sense why this ideology would be popular among wealthy people in the West. It tells them exactly what they want to hear. Not only are you ethically excused from worrying too much about sub-existential threats, but you are actually a morally better person for focusing instead on more important things, risks that could permanently destroy our potential to spawn millions, trillions of post-human offspring across the galaxy. What strikes me most about today's eugenicist vision is the perverse calculus that values the high IQ, high achieving artificial intelligentsia over those most affected by the current multi-crisis, because this tiny minority are cast as the deliverers of humanity's digital redemption. Take this formulation by Nick Beckstead, whose dissertation is cited on many effective altruist websites. Saving lives in poor countries may have significantly smaller ripple effects than improving lives in rich countries. Why? Richer countries have substantially more innovation, and their workers are much more economically productive. So it now seems more plausible to me that saving a life in a rich country is substantially more important than saving a life in a poor country, other things being equal. But other things are not equal, and that's the point. So how does the artificial intelligentsia make sense of inequality? In 2008, AI booster Eliezer Yudkowsky said the quiet part out loud in his blog titled Competent Elites. One of the major surprises I received when I moved out of childhood into the real world was the degree to which the world is stratified by genuine competence. He goes on to recount an experience at a gathering of the mid-level power elite in which his self-imagined elevated status was not so remarkable after all. Quote, "This was the point at which I realized that my childhood prodigy license had officially expired." He describes his surprise that the venture capitalists and CEOs with whom he was mingling were not just fools in business suits. Instead, these people of the power elite were visibly much smarter than average mortals. In conversation, they spoke quickly, sensibly, and by large intelligently. When talk turned to deep and difficult topics, they understood faster, made fewer mistakes, were readier to adopt others' suggestions. Throughout, we find Yudkowsky assessing people's auras as more or less formidable. From average mortals to world-class smart to those who sparkle with extra life force. His words, not mine. He acknowledges his readers' likely discomfort with such assessments, returning in the end to AI as the solution. It's easier for me to talk about such things because rightly or wrongly, I can imagine technologies of an order that could bridge even that gap. So there it is. The purpose of AI is to allow average mortals to truly sparkle. Enter one such sparkly figure, convicted fraudster Sam Bankman-Fried, whose adherence to the ideology of effective altruism insists that the best thing to do for society is to get filthy rich for charity's sake. Whereas Bankman-Fried started out touting lofty goals, signing Bill Gates' giving pledge to donate the majority of his wealth to philanthropy. Soon after graduating with a BA in physics from MIT in 2014, he started working at Jane Street Capital, a proprietary trading firm, and then at the Center for Effective Altruism before getting into crypto. 3 years later, he founded Alameda Research, a cryptocurrency trading firm, and in 2019 launched FTX, which quickly became one of the largest crypto companies globally. But by 2022, FTX had filed for bankruptcy. The company collapsed after losing investors billions of dollars. So for all of the talk of altruism and doing good, he ended up illegally using customers' funds to cover his own expenses, including purchasing luxury properties in the Caribbean, alleged bribes to Chinese officials, and private planes. Perhaps most revealing is this statement made by Bankman-Fried's defense attorney. Sam was not a ruthless financial serial killer who set out every morning to hurt people. He doesn't make decisions with malice in his heart. He makes decisions with math in his head. but perhaps that should be a red flag, in that these sparkly stewards of humanity are determined to engineer a world predicated on the purported morality, or at least neutrality, of math. But as mathematician Aubrey Clayton has written, the eugenics movement deeply influenced the birth and development of statistics and significance testing, so that turning to quantitative reasoning as an objective arbiter is laced with danger from the start. Take the intense focus on optimization and enhancement, which spills over from engineering digital tools to engineering of life itself. If historically eugenics sought to improve the human population through reproductive control, those with limitless resources today are desperate to cheat death by investing in technologies that help them evolve past this mortal frame. The faulty conflation of humans with computers is part of the problem. If brains are computers, then it's no wonder that those who are masters of silicon also fancy themselves as masters of humanity. According to William McCaskill, co-founder of Effective Altruism, some entrepreneurs hope to abandon meat-based bodies altogether and live on in digital form through computer emulation of their brains, including OpenAI CEO Sam Altman, who's a customer of Nectome, a startup that preserves brains with the hope that future generations will scan and upload them. Likewise, the stated aim of Neuralink, the biotech company founded by Musk, is to create brain-computer interfaces to restore autonomy to those with unmet medical needs. But as many have observed, the company's ultimate focus is not therapy, but enhancement, brain-computer connections that are superhuman. Hubris disguised as beneficence, a feature of the old eugenics, is resurrected now in the language of improvement, upgrade. But alas, this zealous desire to transcend humanity ignores the fact that we have not all had a chance to be fully human. Whereas eugenics is often associated with government attempts to control and coerce human reproduction, today's tech elite exhibits similar anxieties about falling birth rates among high IQ populations. Elon Musk's 15 children and counting, with Sam Altman's investment in reproductive technology startups focused on IVF and genetic screening, aim to populate the planet with genetically superior offspring. At an August 2019 conference about artificial intelligence, Musk asserted that, quote, assuming there's a benevolent future with AI, I think the biggest problem the world will face in 20 years is population collapse. Then in 2022, he went even further, tweeting that population collapse due to low birth rates is a much bigger risk to civilization than global warming. As historian Emily Merchant has written, the symbiosis between the tech industry and the pronatalist movement, worried about falling birth rates among the high achieving, reflects a eugenic mindset. And venture capitalists turned pronatalist advocates Malcolm and Simone Collins are the face of this quest to save humanity by having as many babies as possible. Unlike their Christian counterparts, these hipster eugenicists, as they've been dubbed, put their faith in data and science and are focused on producing the maximum number of heirs, not to inherit assets, but genes, outlook, worldview. When asked how their data-driven pronatalism differs from old-school eugenics, Malcolm insists that it's not eugenics because it's not state-sponsored selective breeding, but parental choice. This laissez-faire approach, however, ignores the unequal value of choices. After all, the birth rate is not dropping for everyone. The worry is that more affluent populations and their coveted genes and corresponding worldviews are somehow in danger. Founder of PayPal and Palantir, Peter Thiel, is doing his part for the cause by trying to extend his own life and by investing in eugenic-y ventures like his version of the Olympics, called the Enhanced Games, the Olympics on steroids, literally. Then there's Alex Karp again, who co-founded PayPal with Thiel and whose company Palantir is what one observer called the big tobacco of the tech world. Karp says Palantir is here to disrupt and make the institutions we partner with the very best in the world, and when necessary, to scare enemies and on occasion, kill them. This is the same Karp, by the way, who cast the 2024 Gaza solidarity protests as an enemy claiming that they espouse a thin, corrosive, cancerous ideology, a pagan religion affecting our universities, especially people like me who view themselves as progressives need to stand up, he says. More recently, he spoke to an audience of young people at the anti-woke, unaccredited University of Austin, saying, if you just turn down the volume and watch what's happening on these campuses, you would think it's a reenaction of the KKK. Everyone masked, they're burning things, looks kind of like the KKK. Remember, this is the CEO of a company that produces the very surveillance tools that are being wielded against students protesting genocide, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, and against those experiencing genocide, apartheid, ethnic cleansing. I point this out to remind us that the seemingly far-fetched eugenic dreams of the artificial intelligentsia have real consequences in our own backyards when it comes to their power to influence who is seen as a threat, including on our campuses. So zooming out from these particular characters and their AI boosting and warmongering and villainization of students, all connected, let's come back to the end game. Move fast and break things to accelerate collapse. According to scholars Sarah Roberts and Mel Hogan, accelerationism proposes that we collectively let things unravel to their full extent, socially, politically, economically, environmentally, by stoking rather than seeking to mitigate the forces that drive us toward devastation. In the accelerationist imaginary, they write, the future is not about harm reduction, limits, or restoration. Rather, it is a politics driving towards an endgame of the totalizing undoing of capitalism by capitalism. These projects cater to the right's accelerationist rationale that it is too late to act, too late to come together for collective decision-making, and too late to care. The investment is therefore into a future for the prepared and worthy few and damnation for the rest. So where does that leave the rest of us? I think it leaves us with a choice. Do we continue worshiping at the feet of the artificial intelligentsia, self-appointed stewards of our collective future, those manufacturing techno solutions for problems that they themselves help to create? Behind their duplicity lies a familiar calculus. If AI evangelists can convince us that artificial general intelligence is possible, imminent, dangerous, we might be compelled to entrust our fate to them. Hype and doom, in other words, are two sides of the same Bitcoin. Breathless buzzwords like efficiency, novelty, productivity conceal a self-serving vision. The future imagined by AI evangelists is meant only for a small sliver. The rest of us will be left clamoring to survive on this boiling planet. Alternatively, we can call bullshit on their eugenic futures and listen instead to the collective intelligence of the people pictured here, and many more besides, who have been the consistent and courageous voices calling out the archaic visions of faux futurists purporting to save humanity. There's absolutely no reason to trust that tech elites have any wisdom to offer when it comes to alleviating human suffering. Billionaires building bunkers to survive an AI apocalypse, attempting to disrupt death through cryopreservation, scouting the planet for pop-up cities and network states, are not reliable stewards of the collective good. In fact, one way to understand the war against DEI in this moment, and all the talk of who does or doesn't deserve to be taken seriously as experts and leaders, is that it's a campaign to erode trust in those who've long smelled the smoke and bolster allegiance to sparkly smarty pants who purportedly make decisions with only math in their heads. How very convenient that as part of their AI-powered coup, They're trying to undermine the intelligence and insights of the very people who've been raising the alarm at the first, second, third solutions. With that, I'm going to invite you back tomorrow, when we'll center those whose knowledge and know-how are, I'll argue, much more worthy of our attention.
I knew this was going to be an amazing presentation. And of course, Ruha never fails. This is absolutely wonderful, and I can't think of a better time for us to have a real conversation about all of the issues that she raised in her talk today. So what I want to do is just make a few comments, and then Ruha and I will have a conversation. She begins with Toni Morrison's point about the connection between the creep of fascism and the censorship of dissent. For Morrison, the critical point is that we scholars and citizens must not face fascism in its many forms with silence. And I think if you don't have anything on your computer to remind you of what you need to be thinking about, that might be a good place to start. For Ruha, the question at the heart of her work is how the ideas we research and write about in the academy, in law, and in media are used to shape people's life chances. And I think what she has asked us to do is to interrogate and challenge the current AI projects whose goals are to embed eugenic logics in these technologies in order to colonize the future. And indeed, she shows us that the futures imagined through some AI projects by their creators are ones that are deeply familiar to those of us who study the history of science, biology, and technology. Projects such as workplace algorithms that change the pace of work, she notes. Facial recognition software that can lead to false arrest. Automated triage systems rationing quality health care. And smart weapons that can put humans at a far distance from the harm they cause. The issue is not that these technologies must be used for these purposes, but rather the way in which their development is too often justified on the basis of the so-called benefit that they bring to solve particular problems in current human societies. It is the way that some creators of AI construct the very notion of societal benefit in their technologies, I think is what Ruha wants us to recognize, to theorize, and to question. She wants us to see how these benefits are constructed and regulated through technologies that are built to reshape what societies are, while simultaneously disavowing that intent and ignoring the very people whose life chances these technologies affect, that is all the rest of us. In other words, the AI creators do want to own the future. Now, I think there are a plethora of concepts that characterize this work, especially the part TESCREAL. Transhumanism is a soup that's even hard to pronounce. Transhumanism, extropianism, singularitarianism, cosmism, rationalism, effective altruism, and long-termism. It has been suggested that this complex soup has been inspired by utopian ideals similar to the vision of first-wave eugenicists. Now, given how little most people, I think, know about the history of eugenics, I think it would be important to talk through some of that history to show how these new ideologies have been shaped by that history specifically the two strands that she focuses on, long-termism and effective altruism. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about the Eugenics project. In a way, I hope that many of you will realize after we talk about this a bit, is that you're going to feel like you're in a Wayback Machine. We're coming back to something that has already been a defining set of logics throughout the 20th century. Another question I want us to address is why she characterizes the early eugenicists as futurists. And why does that future involve a humanity that is not flesh and blood? And how we characterize their view of what the roles of biology/technology are in solving the problems within human societies. Now we know that the original eugenicists from the earliest conceptions aimed for a goal of control over reproduction, first and foremost, and then control over human evolution, with the then holy grail of endless human perfectibility. Given the obvious inequalities in our current human societies, she asked how the artificial intelligentsia made sense of human inequality. And the answer that I thought was very interesting was in the words of Udowsky, his individual personal answer. AI will allow average mortals to truly sparkle, which I thought was hilarious, by the way. I'm not sure he knows what sparkle really is. But is that an answer about society? Or is this sort of some kind of strange enlargement of a kind of personal anxiety that somehow these tools can be enabled to represent? But is that about societies? So if the old eugenics was about hubris disguised as beneficence, my question is, why do the new eugenicists need to make that kind of move? Why do they constantly have to say, this is going to be good for the society, it's going to be good for the world? And why don't they, but that's not true, that is not their aim. So why don't they just focus on improvement as a benefit in and of itself, which is what they sell in the first place? Why do they always have to convince the rest of us that this, what they're up to, is for our benefit? That move is very interesting to me, and I hope we can talk more about it. And then I guess I want to ask some questions about, can different notions of the future coexist? Can individuals harness the power to make a different future or futures? The artificial intelligentsia that she describes seem to me not to be able to look over their shoulders and see what might be gaining on them. There are always alternatives, surprisingly unexpected alignments and reconfigurations that happen around us all the time. The eugenical imagination has always been flawed, and it consistently failed from the late 19th century to the present. And we might discuss why it failed and how it failed. And since the 20th century, self-defined brilliant men, usually white, have consistently sought tools that would allow them to enact their dreams of a society full of people like them, or what they dream people like them would be. But as I said, they failed each time. And yet they get up again and again with each new tool. New tools to study the gene, then the genome, then new methods for quantification and classification, new ways to penetrate the brain and define intelligence, new tools to control affect and behavior. That one I think they've really been successful at, though, because so many of us are now addicted to playing with our phones all the time. Can't stop. You think that aspect of what that smartphone produces was a mistake, or was it? It wasn't a bug, but it was a feature to get us all addicted to using our phones all the time. There's no reason why the phone has to have that quality, except for people who want that quality to be part of the society they dream about. So what does it mean then for us to resist this quest for a future that is not about community? It's not about love. These are not things they talk about. none of the comments that Ruha presented us showed us any of that. And so I want to ask some questions again about, has the resistance so far, or how we characterize resistance to this? And I was at a conference over the weekend, and people were talking about some of these things. And one of my colleagues, in his classes, he is actually doing exercises with his students to not use their phones for a day. And they're recording how hard it is to do that. So it's by doing that exercise, they're beginning to understand what they're wrapped up in by these new technologies and what resistance might begin to mean. I also wanted to talk about the women resistors she identifies at the end, and she will talk more about tomorrow. But I want to ask, have they been successful in a certain way? And certainly some of the individuals in that photo were. But I guess where I want to begin our conversation is to paraphrase Audre Lorde. With what tools are we to use to dismantle the master's house? Where are we going to find them? How will we identify them? And how will we understand our collective project, and to what end? So, welcome.
Testing. Did I turn it on?
Can you hear us?
Move it to the other
great.
side? Okay.
I do feel like I'm in a Wayback Machine, really and truly.
Testing.
I don't think.
Testing. 1, 2, 1, 2.
Is that working?
Testing.
Okay.
Wonderful.
So, thank you so much. I'm bursting with questions, but I do want to spend a little bit of time on the old eugenics, just to remind people of what that was and your take on that.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I came here for Evelyn and Tracy and Kabiba. So,
thank you.
And I knew the first thing was going to be like, is it really new though? That a historian would say. And of course, I should put new in quotes, because so many of the distinctions that these, protagonists use to say we're different, we're doing something different, we saw those evidenced in prior eras, including the idea that this is different because it's not state-sponsored, it's about parental choice, individual choice. But old school eugenics needed individual buy-in. It needed individuals. That's why they did these better baby contests at state fairs and all kinds of other ways to enroll us in the project. It was never simply top-down.
No.
And so that's one of the first, more obvious things to trouble the distinction between what are the continuities and discontinuities. I think one of the dangers, like if your introduction to eugenics, new or old, is a talk like this, is that it kind of fetishizes the high-tech aspect of it.
Right.
And what I actually find perhaps even more dangerous and more worthy of our critical attention are the mundane ways in which eugenics operates in our society. You don't need AI to talk about eugenics. You can look at the way that school districts that are allocated money.
Yes.
Like for me, the mundane, the everyday ways in which this imaginary infects our institutions and our systems is even more concerning. If we think about like the stuff that happens in Excel sheets, 6-point font. Mm-hmm. Organizers often remind us that budgets are moral documents that tell us who and what we value. And so, part of it is just to understand that spectrum. Like right now, I'm focusing on this in part because of this moment where we have these bros, evicting government workers and installing AI to decide our taxes, to decide tariffs. And so, shining a light on that, but I would hope that we would be able to see into the mundane in all of the ways
Absolutely.
that, I mean, you know, the pandemic was, you know, the response to the pandemic was a high point in modern eugenics in terms of who was left to die and who was deemed worthy to live. Like all of the triaging, you know, and yes, there were technologies that were employed in the process, but it was also just, you know, thinking about the everyday value of different lives, I think. So that's, you know, that's one thing that I would say in any conversation about eugenics and drawing continuities. One, it always required bottom-up, you know,
Absolutely.
complicity and buy-in. And, you know, we should look to the mundane, to the everyday, the banal forms of harm as part of our analysis.
And but I guess where I wanted to get at is a way in which there's this notion of there's going to be some kind of technology that will solve the world's
Yes.
problems,
Yeah.
society's problems. And that came in at a moment when great migration,
Yeah.
right? Immigration across the country was happening, across the world was happening. At a moment when you could say, well, look, we want you to have better babies, because then we don't have to fix the schools.
Yes.
We don't have to, and then we'll give everybody, all your good babies, we're going to give them IQ tests,
Yes.
our new technology for figuring out who should live and who should
Yes.
not be allowed to live,
Exactly.
and how you can regulate the unfit.
Yes.
And those are the exact same
Yes,
questions.
absolutely.
And every time they had a technology in the past, a lot of those failed.
Yeah.
But with
Yeah.
the discovery of the gene,
Yeah.
the sequencing of the human genome,
Yeah.
the desire on the part of some people, so I'm coming back to the biology first,
Yeah.
but it actually is a melding of the biology and the computer and the
Yes,
artificial
absolutely.
intelligence pieces. That's what's different now.
Yes.
That those have come together to say the same things. Now we really have the tool that's going to fix society.
Yes.
And you don't have to give everybody health care, because we're going to
Yes.
fix that when you have the baby born in a test tube.
Yes.
We're going to go in, we're going to fix whatever might be wrong with that.
Yeah.
And the child will grow up to be even more perfect
Yeah.
than we are. And we'll control evolution as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. It's that marrying together of the capacity and the desire.
Yes.
And so I really think, you know, we should not base our assessment on the relative efficacy of these technologies.
Right.
That is to say, we can say, oh, the problem is they don't work right. Like, the problem is the bias in the technology, not the underlying logic. Because if we
Exactly.
base it on that, the solution is to fix the bias, but the
Right.
technology remains. And so the efficacy can't be the beginning and the end of our analysis and our assessment, because, you know, we think about facial recognition. Let's just, you know, as just one of the more obvious tools that are embedded now into many public spaces, into airports, into everyday life. You know, we can say, oh, the problem is they don't detect darker skin well.
Right.
You know? And so we spend all of our time trying to make it work well on everyone. Equal opportunity oppression.
Exactly.
As opposed to why are we living in a surveillance state? Who cares if it's disparate or biased? I mean, that's an issue, but it can't be based on the efficacy. It has to be really thinking about what are the underlying values? What kind of world are we bringing into being? And so again, you know, for some people, the bias issue is an entry point. It's kind of a gateway critique, but it can't end there.
Cannot.
You know, because, you know, we can think whether it's policing, okay, yay, everyone gets policed the same. Everyone gets surveilled the same. And then what? Right?
Right.
And there will always, in that scenario, be people living in their bunkers, you know, who are evading what the masses now equally experience. And so I think the point about technologies working well is a distinction, and it's a danger, because then we say, oh man, this genetic enhancement works, and we can all get it.
Right. Except we all can't. Right? And it's not designed for everybody to get it. And so I think that focus on efficacy is a blind spot for a lot of us who want to challenge the ways in which these new technologies are being developed and deployed, because it suggests it can be made better. We're complicit in the same story. We can make a technology that's going to make it all better. And it doesn't.
Yeah.
But it's also because that's not what it's designed to do.
Yeah.
And I think coming back to my second question was about, you know, that question about beneficence and hubris. I don't know why they need to keep saying, oh, this is going to be better for everybody, because that is not exactly what they've been saying at all.
Yeah. I love that question. And the image that comes to mind, I feel the reason why that's needed, the self-interest has to be cloaked in beneficence and moral good, is the same reason why when slaves were being held in holding cells on the coast of Ghana, there were churches built on top of those holding cells. Mm-hmm. Like the slaveholders, needed to erect this architecture of morality atop the grotesque bondage of other human beings. Right. Like that's not an exception. It's like those two things go together. You need to be able to sleep at night in order to carry this out. And so, again, these are our fellow human beings who are envisioning a world in which they will be saved, everyone else will. But it needs to be cloaked in moral good and, beneficence in order to, one, not just for themselves, but because it's a campaign, it's a movement. It's about enrolling especially young people in this, young people who want the world to be better. So it has to be infused with this sense of, we're doing something for everyone, because they're capitalizing on that.
Exactly.
And so part of it is part of the marketing of these ideas requires that it be, completely cloaked in notions of good.
And so I remember, thinking when I was first thinking about what to say here as well, is to ask you to say more about how the media is complicit in creating the very blind spots and access to the questions that you've raised all afternoon, to why we don't see those questions in the media. I'm talking about the entire media. We don't see those questions. We're seeing the efficacy argument. But we're not seeing, for example, the fact that, look what just happened. Thousands of people have been just laid off in a day, in 24 hours, with AI-generated, mail that tells them, you don't have a job tomorrow. You're done. You're out. In 24 hours. People aren't talking about that part of it. So what is it that you see in terms of the way that media, you have some wonderful clips about, but they don't speak to the issues that you're speaking to?
Yeah, I don't have a good answer for that. Just, I think about, every week or so, my friend and colleague, Timnit Gebru, who I cited, she rails against the fact that, these figures are given yet another interview, they're idolized even as they're villainized and propped up by the media, when those who have been calling out these harms, including her, are very rarely, their voices and insights very rarely drawn into the conversation. And so I think perhaps many of the same reasons why, the media treats, many other issues from the perspective of elites who own the media, right? And so it's that perspective built in. But I don't have a good answer for why, in this particular context, anything new, anything other than what we already know about how the media, is skewed. Yeah.
So I want to turn to also thinking about, we both were concerned about, the young people and how we want to give them new tools to undo these tools. But I think it's becoming a hard pedagogical place to sit. In part, when I teach about, for example, the history of racial concepts in science and medicine and technology, my students want to go from, I mentioned that on one day, they want to go to the end of the course, which is 16 weeks later, but they want to go there the next week, which is, how do we fix this, Professor Hammonds? I'm depressed. You have to tell us how to fix it right away. I said, we can't unmake it unless we understand how it was made. They don't want to go through the process of how it's made. But you have some more interesting pedagogical tactics to play with.
But it's funny, for that very reason, I titled one of my intro classes, Race is socially constructed, now what? Because that's the question. It's like, now what? Now what do we do? And the way that I've dealt with that structurally in terms of the class is that every class, I try to carve out a little bit of time to show how individuals, groups, movements have worked to contest and push back against whatever the problem spaces that we're talking about. And we can do that historically. You know, one of the examples that I often use in terms of like an intro lecture is talking about George Cuvier and, you know, showing excerpts of statements he made about the superiority of white people, the inferiority of black people. And I point out, you know, like if he was alive today, he would have like all the grant money. He'd be an endowed professor somewhere, you know, like he was mainstream. So we can't distance from him and say he was a pseudoscientist. Right. He was, you know, the man. But I point out that, you know, we might be tempted to defend, oh, he was a man of his time, so we can't really impose our values. But then I bring in his student, one Frederick Tiedemann, who initially went to go study at the feet of Cuvier, and then he started to read and saw what his professor, his teacher, was writing about. Not only the racist bigotry, but the scientific fallacy. And so Tiedemann started to do his own research to essentially underscore the oneness of humanity. And so I point this out to say we don't need to impose our values on the past. There were people living then that were already refuting, already questioning. And so as much as we want to, you know, document this history of scientific racism, I do think we do a disservice to our students by not also showing this parallel history of anti-racist science. That's not new. That has to be built in, because this is the legacy that we're drawing on if we want to carry it forward, that we're not going to outsource anti-racism to the activists and the politicians. Why? Because racism was created in the citadels of learning. Right. It's not from the backwoods, the trailer parks. It was the pedigreed, it was the highly learned. So we have a responsibility. If they created this racist architecture, we are responsible for dismantling it and imagining something new. And there are actual individuals, movements, organizations from all along this history that we can draw on and learn from. And so, again, maybe it's about just, you know, whetting their appetite and saying, you don't have to wait till week 16. Right. Why? Because when you learn about this racist motherfucker right here, his student was right there with him. His student was right there with him. And so students today, guess what? You get to question the paradigms the same way he did. You get to question. Just because it's published doesn't mean it's true. And so, and that is in fact, I mean, a lesson to draw on pedagogically, so we can see how these two currents have always worked together. And then the question is, which one are we going to grow today? If you do nothing, if you pretend like science is in a vacuum, it's not built in this context and this history, that's what you're gonna perpetuate the dominant story, the dominant history. And so it behooves us, I think, to really, you know, shine a light on this tradition of anti-racist science, Tiedemann and many others, who should be taught in not just the history department, but the physics and the biology and the other departments.
Exactly. We try. So I think you've opened a door that I think it's really important for us to have, you know, the courage to walk through. And I guess I want to go back to sort of this proliferation of certain kinds of ideologies. Again, you know, they're connected to reproduction, control of reproduction. They're connected to whatever ways in which these people imagine human perfectibility. But it's also true that the goal of human perfectibility is very tantalizing to many, many people. And so I wonder if you could just say one last word or two of what that tantalizing aspect of human perfectibility that they pursue, that they sell, and that many consumers of it buy. Yeah. I mean, people go in and say, you know, look, you have 5 embryos and we can figure out which one is the smartest, and you can just, you know, bring the smartest one to term.
Yeah. I mean, that's a dissertation-worthy question. I feel like, you know, books could be written. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind always when I see something that on the surface seems, you know, perfectibility or, you know, supremacy, or something that seems like it is aspiring for something good. I'm wondering what's beneath it, what is animating that desire, as you're asking. And one thing I don't think we often think about is the fear of death, the fear of being alone, the idea that, you know, I can't count on anything out here. I need to be able to do everything myself. I need to take care of myself. I need to, I don't know if you guys have seen this documentary. What's it called? It's this guy who's trying to like live forever, all this longevity stuff. Huh? Something, yeah. But he takes 100 pills a day.
Oh, yes,
he
yes,
takes
yes,
the blood
yes,
of his son.
yes.
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
Yes.
So, you know, like to me, he's a very sympathetic character. I mean, I watch it and I don't hate him. I pity him. And there's something there that's like, you know, there's a fear in there, especially when you hear the backstory and so on. And to me, it's so much of it is like, you can't count on your family. You can't count on your neighbors. You don't have community. The social fabric is frayed. And so I have to be able to do everything myself. In fact, about 10 years ago, I was here at Harvard or at a conference. Was it Harvard or MIT? I think it was Harvard. It was here. And it was a Human Genome Rights, Human Genome Part 2 conference. And there was a presentation about research being done on prototrophic humans. What is that? That is engineering ourselves so that we don't need to eat. We create all of our own everything. Okay. There's no need to eat. And of course, there was someone in the corner who was like, what if I like to eat? But it was such an interesting session, you know? I mean, there was so much back and forth. And it was this idea, like, let us engineer a solution for hunger. Again, it had to be framed in terms of world hunger. It couldn't just be, we want to optimize ourselves. It was a solution to world hunger, even though, as someone in the session said, I doubt people who are hungry are looking to become prototrophic humans. So again, a tech solution for a social problem. But again, it's this idea that we have to do everything ourselves, including, we can't even rely on like a food system. We have to engineer ourselves so we don't need food, as opposed to thinking, how can we shape the world? We have enough food. It's just not well enough distributed. And so again, it's this warped way of thinking that is like, we are all isolated individual, whatever. I have to be able to do everything myself. I can't rely on anyone. And again, it makes sense that those who are bought into this ideology are also the ones ripping up the social fabric. I mean, these things go together.
Exactly.
So it's not a good answer, but it's just trying to connect the threads and also to try to see like what's behind it. It's not simply like animus and negative feelings. It's like pitiful type of warped thinking about what the solution is.
Yeah, and it's coming from a place where it's about that sense of that you actually can have that kind of control over your flesh and blood. That you don't need community, you don't need a living mother. You can, if you're born in an artificial womb or something like that, you don't need anything but your own smart resources that can be optimally enhanced and enhanced and enhanced.
Exactly.
So I think you leave us with that, and then we go on to what you can do about it.
Yes, and be sure to eat. That's good.
So thank you. See you tomorrow at 4 o'clock. That was fun. Oh, that was fun.